We apologize for the technical difficulties, but we hope people will be jumping in with us and enjoying the rest of the evening with us. My name is Gianna Russo. I am an assistant professor of English and creative writing at St. Leo University, and I'd like to welcome you to Recharge with Reading. This is our fall keynote event, and we're very excited about having Professor Jack E. Davis with us tonight. Before we get started, I want to thank the Cannon Memorial Library and Director Doris Van Campen Bright, and the Office of Academic Affairs and Vice President Mary Spoto for sponsoring Recharge with Reading and this evening. There will be other events for Recharge with Reading planned throughout. There are other events planned throughout the year, so please keep an eye out for those. And I'd also like to thank Professor John David Harding, whose dedicated efforts and hard work helped to make tonight a reality. Tonight, we welcome Jack E. Davis, Professor of History and the Rothman Family Chair in the Humanities at the University of Florida, where he specializes in environmental history and sustainability studies. Jack Davis is the author of several books, numerous articles, and the winner of several awards, including the Pulitzer Prize in 2018 for his book, The Gulf, The Making of an American Sea. More about that in a minute. Professor Davis joined the faculty of UF in 2003 after having been awarded a Fulbright Scholarship in 2002 and previously teaching at the University of Alabama at Birmingham and at Eckerd College. His 2001 book, Race Against Time, Culture and Separation in Natchez Since 1930, won the Charles S. Sidner Prize for the best book in Southern history. His 2009 book, An Everglades Providence, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas and the American Environmental Century, received a gold medal from the Florida Book Awards. With his former student Leslie Poole, Professor Davis recently co-edited The Wilder Heart of Florida, More Writers Inspired by Florida Nature, a collection of personal essays and poems about natural Florida that will be published in March of next year. Last year, he was one of only 32 recipients nationwide awarded an Andrew Carnegie Fellowship to support the writing of his latest book, Bird of Paradox, How the Bald Eagle Saved the Soul of America, a cultural and natural history of the bald eagle. The book is scheduled for publication in March 2022. Professor Davis divides the seasons between two villes, Gainesville, Florida, and Harrisville, New Hampshire. Now to talk for just a minute about The Gulf, The Making of an American Sea. When the book came out in 2017, reviewers across the country immediately recognized the breadth of its historical and lyrical impact. The Wall Street Journal calls the Gulf informative, lyrical, inspiring, and chilling for anyone who cares about the future of America's sea. In a review for the New York Times, Dwight Garner notes that the Gulf is, quote, a sensitive and sturdy work of environmental history and the first comprehensive history of the Gulf of Mexico. In the New York Times book review, Philip Connors confesses his trepidation about being entertained by such a massive book. It is 592 pages. But he ends up, quote, my doubts proved unwarranted. Davis has written a beautiful homage to a neglected sea, a lyrical paean to its remaining estuaries and marshes, and a marvelous mashup of human and environmental history. The Gulf was a New York Times notable book for 2017 and made several best of lists for the year, including those of the Washington Post, NPR, Forbes, and the Tampa Bay Times. The Gulf was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award for nonfiction, and winner of the Kirkus Prize for nonfiction, and as already noted, winner of the Pulitzer Prize for history. In an interview for the Pulitzer Prize, Professor Davis claims that writing the book was a labor of love. He wanted it to be, quote, a history of the human relationship with Gulf nature, and says his driving motivations were, quote, to present the audience the history of the sea that had never been written about, and also to restore the Gulf's true identity after the BP oil spill. And he emphasizes, we have this wonderful, living, giving sea, and we've taken a lot from that sea, but to continue to do so, we have to give back. It is my honor and pleasure to present Professor Jack E. Davis.
Thank you, Gianna, and for that very nice introduction. And thank you, John David, also, both of you, for inviting me to be a part of this series. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. And thank all of you who are streaming in this evening. And thank you very much for your 29 minutes of patience, I think it was. But we seem to have finally worked through things, and I hope we didn't lose too many people. I love talking about the Gulf of Mexico. I think you might gather from Gianna's introduction. One correction, though. As much as I love Phil Connor's review in the New York Times Book Review, the book is not 592 pages. It's only 530. So don't feel daunted by it. And it's the kind of book that you can poke around here and there throughout. Read one. You could start with chapter 11 or 12, or start with the prologue, wherever you want to start, just look at the chapters. And if you decide to even pick up the book, look at the chapter titles and start with something that sounds of most interest to you. And I don't think you'll get lost in the book. Indeed, it was a labor of love to write, and I want to talk a little bit about the writing tonight. I also want to talk about the importance of connecting with the reader. I want to talk about, elaborate a little bit more on why I wrote the book. Gianna touched on some of that, and maybe give you a little sense of Gulf history, and then, of course, take any questions you might have. And so let me start with why I wrote the book. I grew up on the Gulf of Mexico, and I imagine that a lot of the folks streaming in did too, or have lived on the Gulf for a number of years. And it's one of those seas you instantly fall in love with, I think. I have a former student from University of Florida who one of her first jobs taught in St. Petersburg, and now she's in Wilmington, North Carolina on the Atlantic. And I just exchanged an email with her today. I said, I hope you're enjoying that other sea. And she wrote back, she said, the Atlantic's nice, but it's not the Gulf of Mexico. And I think a lot of us can agree with that. Atlantic is quite nice, but it's, as I write in the book, it's the sea that's has a sort of an impersonal feel to it, whereas the Gulf is something I think you can relate to more on an intimate level. I mean, we share the Atlantic Ocean with 40 some odd other countries. We share the Gulf of Mexico with only two others, and that's Mexico and Cuba. And the United States occupies almost exactly to the mile 1/2 of the Gulf of Mexico coastline. And, this is a sea that is very much, as my subtitle suggests, and it's very much an American sea, but we don't think of it that way. We don't embrace the Gulf of Mexico so much as a part of our history, which is one reason why I wanted to write this book. You can look at virtually any textbook assigned, U.S. history textbook assigned in a high school classroom or a college classroom, and there's a good chance the Gulf of Mexico won't even show up in the index. And if it's mentioned in these books, it's only mentioned in passing. It's just something that happens to be part of a context, but it's not something that had any sort of role, or it's not presented that way, as any sort of role in American history. And that's something I very much disagree with. And I wanted to correct that in the American historical narrative. I wanted to bring the Gulf of Mexico into that American historical narrative. I also wanted to show the Gulf of Mexico as a historical agent in history. As an environmental historian, I see nature as a shaping force in the course of human history. We often think, or historians typically write history as something that is driven by human decision making. They don't take into account the fact that there are other driving forces out there. There are other impulses that are impinging on human history and directing it, along with that human decision making. And so, in organizing this book as a book that would bring nature into the forefront of human history, a book that is really about the human relationship with Gulf nature. The way I decided to bring nature into the forefront as a historical agent was to organize the chapters not around human events, wars, economy, exploration, settlement, so forth. I decided instead to organize the chapters around natural characteristics of the Gulf of Mexico, fish, birds, beaches, weather, hurricanes in particular, barrier islands, and oil, which I didn't want, and I'll talk about this in just a minute, which I did not want to dominate the narrative of this book, but oil too, which is a natural characteristic of the Gulf of Mexico. And as Gianna said, I wanted to correct the American image of the Gulf of Mexico following not only the BP oil spill, but also Hurricane Katrina. The Gulf of Mexico, unfortunately, has this image within our country, particularly one that's conveyed by the media. No offense to the media, but particularly one that's conveyed by the media, of this place that is an oil sump and an oil supplier, a hurricane alley, and maybe a vacation spot for many Americans. And I knew that the Gulf had a much richer history, that it was more than what it was portrayed as. And so not only did I want my readers to understand that the Gulf has this rich and wonderful history that's very much woven into American history, but all Americans, not just Gulfsiders, but all Americans are connected to the Gulf of Mexico, both historically and ecologically. And I'll talk a little bit about those connections in just a minute. But I want to turn for a moment and talk about the readership, my audience that I had envisioned for this book. I'm an academic, but I don't write my books for academics. You write an academic book, what happens to it? It ends up on the cold steel shelf in the university library, and it pretty much stays there. And as I like to say, you can do the $20 bill test with an academic book. You go to the library, you pull your book off the shelf, you open it at page 100, throw a $20 bill in there, put it back on the shelf, come back 10 years later, and retrieve your $20 bill. That is not the kind of book I wanted to write. And the Gulf was too important of a subject for me to write the book solely for my colleagues. So as I did with Marjorie Stoneman Douglas' book, the book I wrote before the Gulf of Mexico book, I envision my audience as the intellectually curious reader, an intellectually curious popular audience. And so when I sat down to write this book, and I think other writers out there who may be, in fact, streaming in this evening will agree with me, your audience, your readership is extremely, it's an integral part of the writing process. It's important to keep who you intend your audience to be in mind as you're writing your book. You want to maintain a connection as you're writing. And so obviously you want to inform them. You want to share something with them that is new, that perhaps they don't know or are not aware of, or perhaps aware of and not aware of in the depth that you might potentially present it. You want to maintain their interest, of course, and you want to be able to explain or say things in a way that they can understand. So for many writers, every word that you put on the page is a decision made. And it's a decision made in the interest of clarity. You never, ever should, at least my philosophy as a writer is, you should never, ever sacrifice clarity for style or for form. And sometimes you have to give up something in the way of form or style to ensure that you have the clarity. But there are oftentimes you can find the right balance between style and clarity, a pleasing or an interesting presentation of an idea, for instance. Storytelling is important to readers, right? Readers like to read stories. Some readers like to read about nature, but all readers like to read about people, and they like to read about themselves. And so even when you're writing about the environment, it's important, I believe, to also weave in a human story in some way. So although I organize these chapters around natural characteristics of the Gulf, I use stories of particular people or peoples within each chapter as a narrative device to help drive the narrative. And so let me give you an example. Chapter 12 of the book about barrier islands is the very first chapter I wrote for the book. And I knew it would not be the first chapter. I knew it would fall somewhere in the middle of the book. But I started with that chapter, as writers will tell you, sometimes it's hard to find your way into a story, whether it's a short piece or a long piece or an article or book. Sometimes it's hard to find your way in. So you've got to find some way to trick yourself, discover some way to trick yourself to lead yourself into your story. And with chapter 12, I knew that my human character, I like to call them rather than subjects, my human character, my main human character in that chapter would be Walter Anderson. Some of you may be familiar with him. Walter Anderson was an artist on the Mississippi coast. I call him the artist laureate of the Gulf of Mexico, who's lived in the early and mid 20th century, died in 1965, and spent most of his time in the last 20 years of his life on the Barrier Islands off the coast of Mississippi and Louisiana. And I was familiar with Walter Anderson before I started writing the book. And I knew that as an artist, as somebody who painted nature, as a nature artist, that and by reading his island logs that he kept when he was out on these barrier islands, which were not occupied by people, but there was a great deal of living and great deal of life out on those islands with the non-human life, the various animals, birds and terrestrial animals and fish and others that lived out on these islands. I knew that his environmental sensibilities were very similar to mine. So I knew that Walter Anderson would lead me, show me the way into this chapter, and then this chapter would show me the way into this book. So this particular chapter is organized around Walter Anderson's relationships with the barrier islands. And that has allowed me to expand out from his own narrative to talk about the nature of these barrier islands, their origins, what exactly they are, what purpose they serve ecologically, what is their relationship with the coastline, and then, of course, what is their relationship with us? And those of us, I grew up in the Tampa Bay area, and those of us who live in that part of Florida know that you can be out on a barrier island and you don't even know you're out on a barrier island because they're so developed today. And if not for a bridge, you would think you're still on the mainland. And you might forget that bridge and still think you're on that mainland. But there's much more to barrier islands and certainly to their history than condominium towers and hotels. And I write about that in the book. And so what Walter Anderson is this infinitely interesting character. If you haven't read the book and you're interested in picking it up, as I said earlier, you can start with any chapter you want. Start with chapter 12. Start with the chapter that I started with. I think you will find that Walter Anderson is this fascinating character that will draw you right into the narrative. I use a lot of artists. I draw on a lot of artists and writers and poets in my books because for a couple of reasons. One is that I think that they see life in a way that is different from most of us. And so I think they have something in their works, in their art, their paintings, Walter Anderson's paintings, or in their writings or in the poetry that say something about life, and in the case of my writing, nature, that we might not recognize otherwise, even if we study science. They can also say or express things eloquently in a way that sometimes the writer can't. But also I use them because I think that readers find them fascinating people. As I said earlier, readers like to read about people. They like to read about others. And if you can find somebody who's fascinating as Walter Anderson or Nash Roberts, who was the first TV weatherman in New Orleans, who became my narrative driver in the chapter on weather and hurricanes. And let me tell you something. Who, besides Roy Leet, and some of you probably remember Roy Leet from the Tampa Bay area, who has a better TV weatherman name than Nash Roberts? And it turned out he had this rich personal history that fit perfectly in with what I was trying to convey with this chapter. So my point here is that keeping your readers, keeping your audience in mind, respecting the people who you hope to pick up your book and dive into it is utterly important to writing the book. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the Gulf of Mexico, or I was trying to make this point with this book, remind readers or inform readers, not just remind them because they didn't know to begin with, but inform readers that they are connected to the Gulf of Mexico, both historically and ecologically, whether they live on the Gulf of Mexico or not, whether they've even seen the Gulf of Mexico or not. Because the Gulf of Mexico is this, as I have stated repeatedly, is this American sea. Meaning that not only is it connected historically to other parts of America, it's connected culturally and it's connected ecologically. Let me give you an example. The Mississippi River, the largest river in North America, flows down to the Gulf of Mexico. The Mississippi River drains some 63% of the geographic area of the lower United States and parts of lower Canada. Well, there's an ecological connection to you from Western New York to the southern parts of the Canadian provinces, central provinces, to the Rocky Mountains. Anything that goes in the ground or goes in a stream in those areas ends up in the Gulf of Mexico by way of rivers, and in particular the Mississippi River. Those barrier islands around the Gulf, the beautiful white beaches that we have in Florida, they don't originate. When I was a kid growing up, we'd ask our parents, where did the beach come from? Oh, it comes, the sea washes in the sand. That's in part true, but where does the sand come from before the sea is washing it ashore? Well, those beautiful white quartz beaches we have here in Florida are courtesy of the Appalachian Mountains, which at one time were as tall as the Himalayan mountains. But over the eons, rain, wind, and ice chipped away at those mountains, eroded those mountains, and washed the quartz down over land and down streams and down rivers to the Gulf of Mexico. And as I write in the book, when you walk on a beach, you're walking on a mountain. Again, that sand comes from faraway places. If any of you have been to a Louisiana beach, you know those beaches are pretty, as I like to say, but ugly. They're as brown as the paneling in your ugly den, your dark brown den. That's because what builds those beaches is the sediment that flows down from places like Iowa and Minnesota. If you've ever seen a plowed field in Iowa, that's the parts of that is a future beach down on Louisiana coast. And if you go to Texas, Texas brings in sediment, or the rivers that flow to the Texas coast, including the Rio Grande, the Brazos, and the Colorado, bring sediment from as far away as the Rocky Mountains. And whatever those rivers, whatever terrain those rivers pass through, they bring sediment from that terrain. So in Texas, you get yellow sand, you get pink sand, you get beige sand, and you get a little bit of white sand. You get a whole mix. I still think Florida's beaches are the best, are the most attractive, the most beautiful beaches. But also people have long been, from faraway places, have long been connected to the Gulf of Mexico. And to give you an example, in the late 19th century, sport fishing emerged as a popular pastime along the Gulf of Mexico, along the 5 Gulf states of Mexico. And also down in Mexico itself, in parts of the country of Mexico. The sport fishing world knew about the tarpon. This is a fish that very much wanted to catch, but nobody figured out how to hook a tarpon until an architect from New York hooked the first one, at least on record, in 1885 in what is now Tarpon Bay off of Sanibel. And once he did this, his catch, this phenomenal thing that he'd done in hooking a tarpon, made the news wires. It was written in newspapers around the country and magazines, and it set the sport fishing world on fire. And people from the Northeast, from the Midwest, and the British Isles converged on the Gulf of Mexico because everybody wanted to catch a tarpon. They knew it would be this wonderful fighting fish, in which it was. But also with commercial fishing. Now, some of you know that the Spanish occupied the Gulf of Mexico region for 300 years. The British occupied it for a brief period. The French occupied it for a brief period. None of those powers, none of those nations, none of those empires established a commercial fishing industry in the Gulf of Mexico. That was left to enterprising Americans. And that didn't happen until really beginning in the 1830s. And not by Gulfsiders, by New England fishermen who came down to the Gulf of Mexico during the wintertime. They are our original snowbirds. They came down to the Gulf of Mexico in the wintertime and fished. They had overfished many of their cod grounds up in the northern Atlantic, and so they were looking for new, fresh fishing grounds. And they would spend the season down here catching fish, trading at the port of New Orleans, which was one of the busiest seaports in the U.S. because it's on the Mississippi River, and the Mississippi River connects so much of the rest of the country. And they traded at Havana. Eventually places like Pensacola and Apalachicola and Key West. And so it was really New Englanders who launched the commercial fishing trade in the Gulf of Mexico. And today for the U.S., commercial fishing in the Gulf of Mexico outperforms in most seasons, in most years, unless we have an oil spill, the entire East Coast fishery from Maine down to southern Florida. Think about that. It's quite remarkable. As far as recreational fishing, the Gulf of Mexico is the most popular saltwater fishing hole in the United States, generating some $5 to $6 billion in income for the U.S. Gulf states. And so I wanted my readers to know when right from the start, that the Gulf of Mexico, again, is not this regional sea. It's this American sea. And so I opened the book, the prologue of the book, the very first thing that you encounter in reading the book, with a historical character who's not from the Gulf of Mexico. I made the calculated decision not to open up with, say, Nash Roberts or Walter Anderson, but somebody from a faraway place. And so I chose Winslow Homer. Winslow Homer, of course, was from Maine, known for, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, he was the premier seascape artist in the United States. And he painted a lot of scenes from Maine. Every winter he'd go down to the Bahamas, where he'd go over to St. Augustine, Jacksonville. He would paint there. But late in life, in the 60s, he discovered the Gulf of Mexico. He loved to come down here for the warm weather, but also for the fishing. He was an avid sport fisherman, as well as an artist. So I opened with him because I knew that, or I believe that he would establish this connection between the Gulf and some other part of the United States. And except for California, it's harder to go farther away than Maine. And so what I want to do now is take a moment and read from you the opening of the book with Winslow Homer, to give you a sense of the tone of the book, but also to share with you how I use, after I read it to you, so it'll only take about 3 minutes, how I use Winslow Homer as a narrative device to introduce this book. And it should, I'm hoping it will become evident to you when I read this opening section of this 530-page book, not 592-page book. In 1904, Winslow Homer spent the month of January fishing midway up Florida's west coast, where Homosassa River quietly slips into the Gulf of Mexico. The painter laureate of the Atlantic had never been on the Gulf, and it delighted him with its natural palette of sea and shore, its color, movement, and history. Behind reedy coastal marshes rose a dense woodland, a jungle of green, as Homer portrayed it, where splaying air plants and ferns hung in mottled sunlight, and the scent of aromatic cypress and red bay trees vied with traces of rotting organic muck. Homer likely listened for the double knock of ivory-billed woodpeckers sounding from interior corners and studied the stealth pose of herons and egrets quietly fishing in the water. Its sweeping, calm surface was the perfect vision of contentment, though a deceptive veneer over the restless energy below. Wherever Homer drifted with bait and tackle, the water beneath his rowing skiff was clear, several feet to a grassy bottom, flush with crabs, mollusks, and 1,000 living things unseen. Among most scintillating of sights were fish in schools as long as freight trains running with the invisible Gulf tide. Their imposing numbers invited eagles and ospreys that circled overhead, and the wading birds tending to the shallows. They invited Homer, too, on return trips for years after. He was 68 years old, trim as ever, mustached as always, and at the height of his fame as a painter, acclaimed for his Atlantic seascapes. Together, Gulf nature and the patina of the past aroused his artistic sensibility. He was prepared for such moments. Wherever he traveled with rod and reel, he carried paints and brushes. As he matured as an artist, the native scenery migrated on his canvas and paper from backdrop to focal point. In many of his Atlantic seascapes, human subjects appear in detail, front and center, and often in contest with spirited, sometimes raging seas that speak to nature's paramount authority. Retaining this forthrightness in compositions of the Gulf, where the water was often as unruffled as a mill pond, required adjusting the scale of complementary elements. Among several watercolors that Homer completed at Homosassa, human subjects recede into a dab of color against a slate of restful water and a wall of green, on which palm trees ascend toward buff clouds and into the center of each work. In one such painting, shell heap, sable palm, shade, an aboriginal mound, spilling discarded oyster shells down to the water's edge, where two anglers float in a skiff, suggesting a continuity between the ancient and the recent. Like all of Homer's homosassa paintings, Shell Heap conveys an intimate and vital connection linking humankind, nature, and history. I call this triad Homer's truth, and it lies at the heart of this book. So again, I opened with Homer because he comes from Maine. He's a connection to another place. But also, it turned out that Homer, in the way he saw the Gulf of Mexico and the way he painted it in his watercolors, was similar to the way I wanted to present it to my readers. But also, his paintings conveyed that triad that I talk about, nature, humanity, and history. Which I believe is how, again, he also understood this particular, very much natural place where he was. You have to understand, this is in the early 20th century. Think of Homosassa Springs. It didn't look anything like it does today. It was at the most a little hamlet at the time with a very small population. And I talk about Homosassa in his days in this book as well. But throughout the book, I make other connections with other people in other parts of the country, and even beyond American shores. And I make connections with activities in the rest of the country as well, and show how the Gulf of Mexico impinged upon Gulf nature, I should say, impinged upon major historical events, such as the Civil War, such as the Louisiana Purchase, and much more, also World War II, and much more. I didn't state at the outset of the book, but at the outset of my talk, but the book covers the period from geological formation to the present, but it focuses on the 5 U.S. states, because I envision my audience as American readers. And so I wrote this book, excuse me, I wrote this book for them. So why don't I go ahead and stop there, and Gianna, we can open up for questions. Does that sound good to you?
Sounds great. So I've just opened a little place in the chat. If you've got questions for Dr. Davis, if you'd go ahead and post your question there, that would be wonderful. I like to kind of kick things off myself, Dr. Davis, by asking you, I'm very interested in your combining or looking for some sort of inspiration to artists and poets. And of course, you do quite a bit of that in this book. Yeah. I wanted to ask you just a little bit more about some of the other artists that appear in the book. What drew you to these people? And is it just because they were interested in Florida or the Gulf, or anything that you'd have to say?
Well, obviously they had to have something to say about the Gulf of Mexico. And sometimes it didn't have to be very much. One poet, for instance, that I referred to in the Gulf of Mexico is a 20th century poet, Wallace Stevens. And Wallace Stevens used to vacation down in the Keys and on the Gulf of Mexico. And he loved to fish. He was an insurance executive who was also a poet, and whose great pastime was fishing. And so he was inspired by the Gulf to write some verse about the Gulf of Mexico. And so some things that I found in his poems I used in the book because I thought that they would help bring life to the narrative. Let me give you an example. One of his 2-word phrases that I absolutely love, and I think I used it as a chapter title. In one of his poems, he referred to the Gulf of Mexico as a fishy sea. And 2 words said so much about the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, it brings so much to your mind. Those 2 words evoke this image that I wanted to convey to my readers. And as I say in the book, I could cite all of the scientific information about how many, about the marine biomass, of the Gulf of Mexico. Boring biomass, just that word, okay? Marine biomass, so those 2 words. Or I can refer to, his phrase, a fishy sea. Sidney Lanier, another poet, who very poetically listed all the fish that he encountered or saw in the Gulf of Mexico in the 19th century. So from him, I get this beautiful poetic list. But I also, that is an inventory of the marine biomass, or particular finny marine biomass of the Gulf of Mexico. And so I use them if they've got something interesting to say. I use them if they can help enliven the narrative, my own writing. But also, as you know, Gianna, you encounter those creative minds, either from the present or the past, and they're surround myself with these creative minds. And I'm doing the same thing in the Bald Eagle book too. I am always looking, or I'll be finished with the book by the end of December. And in writing this book, I have searched high and low for writers and poets and artists, and found quite a few. And it's the other thing, or other reason why, and I'm being long-winded here, I'll stop when I say this, but the other reason is they help make the writing or the story exciting for me. And once it's exciting for me and I become passionate about it, I think that my passion is often conveyed to the reader, and perhaps that my own excitement is passed on to them.
Thank you so much. I loved hearing all of that, especially as a poet myself. I loved hearing it. Now, I'm seeing some questions come in on our question and answer Q&A little format here. And the first few are from a couple of my colleagues who are biologists. Dr. William Ellis says, I don't know, are you able to see these? Or I think I'm...
I am able to see there. Yeah, Bill Ellis, as a son of the Gulf who has spent his life on and under the water of our American sea, thank you for the love letter to my home, my center. Thank you, Bill, for saying that. That means so much to me. As a teacher of marine ecology, thank you for the beautiful lure. Certainly, I don't want to give any impression that, because I'm sort of disparaging marine biomass. It has its place, right? Science writing has its place. And I relied heavily upon scientific studies to write this book. But I see myself as something of a translator. And I'm very grateful for what scientists have taught us about the Gulf of Mexico. And so, hey, Bill, it was my pleasure to write this book, and I'm so glad that you've, as a son of the Gulf of Mexico as I am, that it's been meaningful to you. And then from Christopher Miller, I'm currently doing biological research in the area of the Big Bend region of Florida, basically from Cedar Key to Apalachicola. It seems this area is especially well not explored, but I was hoping to receive some advice on early exploration, 1920s or so, documenting the coastline. Well, as I do in the book, one of the sources I use is the logs of the U.S. Coast Survey from the 19th century, which began surveying the coastline of the Gulf before the Civil War, but then, of course, the Civil War is disrupted. It's a fascinating history because many of those surveyors, or as assistants as they were called, ended up participating in the war, aiding the U.S. Navy on the Gulf of Mexico. But those logs are available online, the U.S. Coast Survey logs, and there, I think you'll find some really fantastic information in them regarding the Big Bend area. And you can also perhaps go back to, and the name is escaping me, there are a couple, they're in my book, there are a couple early geographers from the British period who might have something to offer as well. You know, it's worth looking at Sidney Lanier's book on Florida, his travel book that he wrote in the 1870s on the Gulf of Mexico. On Florida, he traveled to Cedar Key, and that was really his contact place with the Gulf of Mexico. And he has some beautiful descriptions of that area from the 19th century. And you may also be aware of the Historical Society in Cedar Key that has a pretty decent archive. I highly recommend contacting my colleague here at UF in the anthropology department, Ken Sassaman, Sassaman, maybe Sassaman, Ken Sassaman, who studies indigenous cultures, is doing a lot of work on Cedar Key, and he's a wealth of information. So I think that he can be helpful as well. So I hope that provides you something.
Thank you so much. Great.
Yeah, and let's see, Melissa Beam. My apologies for butchering that. What first piqued your interest in Gulf history and Southern history? What drew you to research in this field originally? Well, as I say, growing up in the Gulf of Mexico, very much like Bill Alice, I participated in every kind of sport, on top of the water, under the water, and as I write in, I think in the acknowledgments of the book, the Gulf of Mexico, growing up in the Gulf of Mexico, was the cul-de-sac of my youth. You know, the bays and the bayous and the sounds were the cul-de-sac of my youth. The docks were the sidewalks. My little boat was my bicycle, my rod and reel, or my bat and ball. So there was this intimate relationship with the Gulf of Mexico, and I really think it is. But all right, let me just say this: is there any other place in the United States that has more beautiful sunsets than the Gulf of Mexico? Is there any other place that can move you? And there are beautiful sunsets around. I spent part of my year up in New Hampshire, beautiful sunsets up there. But boy, let me tell you what, it's just to see this, because the sunsets are not just the sun, it's the pelicans, soaring past inches above the water. It's the other shorebirds that are diving in to get their last meal of the day. It's that breeze, it's the wind shifting, the breeze shifting from offshore, from inland blowing out to the Gulf. All of that's happening at the same time when you're experiencing a Gulf of Mexico sunset. And I have to say, in writing this book, I live landlocked here in Gainesville, and that's tough sometimes for somebody who grew up on the water, and I miss it horribly. But in writing this book, I'd sit down every morning. I'd get up at 5 o'clock, and that's when I write. I I was back on the Gulf of Mexico whenever I sat down and wrote this book. And I like to say that the Gulf of Mexico and the history of the Gulf of Mexico showed me how to write this book, and that it really wrote it for me. And so thank you for that question. Tamara, what is your favorite part of the Gulf or place on the Gulf of Mexico? Oh, that's no fair. Everybody, I get that question a lot. There's so many of them. Christopher, I mean, you can attest. The Florida Big Bend is a spectacular place. I mean, it's so extraordinary compared with other parts of the Florida Gulf Coast, which is not to say that those white sand beaches aren't beautiful, and the sand dunes along the Florida Panhandle are spectacular. But there are just so many other places. I love Ocean Springs, Mississippi, where the Walter Anderson Museum is. Excuse me. And I highly, highly recommend a visit to the Walter Anderson Museum. You walk into that museum, you walk into his world of the Gulf of Mexico. And it's just, you're just swallowed up in it. And it's fantastic. And the Barrier Islands off the Mississippi Sound. I love the whole Mississippi coast. And the Louisiana, let me tell you something about the Louisiana coastline. They have the ugliest beaches in the world, but let me tell you what, this is a place that also is, it's spectacular in its own way. It has 5,000 square miles of coastal marshes. It's in this very ethereal place to visit. I just love being in the marshlands of coastal Louisiana. Same thing with around Mobile, Alabama, too. Boy, if you ever get up to Mobile, take a tour of the coastal marshes around Mobile. Texas, Padre Island. I don't know if anybody's been on Padre Island. The original unit in the Gulf Islands National Seashore, the longest barrier island on the Gulf Coast, and the seashore area that's been set aside by the National Park Service is another one of those places that if you're not moved, and when you're standing there in the middle of this this natural area, then you better check your pulse, because again, it's very ethereal area. Wow, some great questions, some more here. Rachel?
Professor Davis, I'm going to interrupt you for just a second because we don't want to have you all night, even though we'd love to.
Sure.
So I think what we're going to do is maybe look at one or two other small questions, and there's so many great ones here.
Do you have something that you picked out?
Well, we'll just be fair and we'll go in the order. So we had a couple, I think we could combine them. What's your favorite moment in the novel and your favorite fun fact that you learned about the Gulf? Of course.
Well, let me point out, the Gulf is not a novel. Novel is
yes.
And I don't think I made too much stuff up. But my favorite moment in the book, God, there are just so many. Can I say who my favorite character is?
Of course.
That's Walter Anderson. And again, I think if you open up, if you start the book with chapter 12, you'll see why. I mean, but there's so many wonderful characters, so many heroes in the Gulf of Mexico, and men and women, and who are all just fascinating. But let's say if I wanted to go back and live on the Gulf of Mexico in a particular decade, it depends on where I live. Let's say if I were going to do it in Florida. I think the 1950s is a really interesting time in Florida. That another one of my favorite characters in the book, who is, of course, John D. Mcdonald, who set most of his crime fiction novels on the Gulf of Mexico, or parts of the Gulf of Mexico, but also South Florida on the East Coast. But he was from lived in Sarasota, where he wrote virtually all of his books. And I think that's a fascinating time. And things weren't so spoiled then. That really starts happening in the late 50s and in the 1960s. What's your favorite fun fact you learned about the Gulf of Mexico? Oh, gosh. These are great questions, and I'm sorry I don't have answers to them. The most fun fact is, the importance of one of them is the importance of the tarpon in the development of Florida and Gulf tourism. It didn't start with the beaches. It started with this fighting fish, which I think is a fun fact. And then maybe one more here because I love that. And this also deals with a fun fact because I loved writing about this. In Thunder Bay, the movie starring Jimmy Stewart, 1953, you quoted his main character in chapter 10. Progress is not without fault, my friend. What do you think about what is happening with all the ecosystems we are losing in a rapid pace with all these new developments? Well, I think it's obviously, I think losing ecosystems, estuarine environments is a horrendous thing. I should say we virtually wiped them all out in the late 1960s, in the early 1970s, when we were pumping all of our raw sewage from Florida, not just Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, all the Gulf states, all of our raw sewage into the bays and the bayous, into those estuarine environments. And as a consequence, along with some industrial discharge too, and not just shoreside municipalities, but municipalities up these rivers that flow to the Gulf of Mexico from faraway places were dumping their raw sewage. Alabama was dumping, I think it was 8 wastewater treatment plants were dumping raw sewage into the Scambia River that flowed down the Scambia River to Pensacola. And if you know what Alabama looks like on a map next to Florida, I describe Alabama in the book as the buttocks sitting on the throne of the Florida Panhandle. And Alabama's little coastline is little legs hanging over the throne. But we brought those estuarine environments back to life because we all pitched in. We all realized that this wasn't just simply about nature. This is about our quality of life. And this was also about our economy. And that's what I like to remind people and environmental groups as well who focus on nature, that there is this connection, this vital connection between humanity and those natural environments that support the birds and the fish as well. And I think the destruction of places like Pine Island Sound and on the other side, the St. Lucie estuarine environment is unforgivable and reprehensible and inexcusable. You're destroying people's livelihoods. You're destroying the marine life. You're sending the bird life elsewhere. You're destroying tourism on the Gulf of Mexico. So on that passionate note, maybe I'll stop. How's that sound, Gianna?
Thank you, Professor Davis. It's been just great. And yeah, it's a shame that we have kind of come to the end of our evening and we don't have time for some of these other comments and questions. Yeah. I'm just so happy that you were able to join us, and we all appreciate your patience in our dealing with the technical difficulties at the beginning, and also the patience of all the people that ended up jumping in with us. I think our high count at one point was over 50 people, so that was terrific. So thank you again. I do want to make a mention, everybody. I'm seeing in the comments that many of you have already read the book, but if you haven't, you can get a signed copy. Professor Davis was kind enough to sign some plates, really, that we are able to put into the book. And you can order the book through the university bookstore. You see the number here on your screen, or if you're on campus, you can visit the bookstore directly, and we'll give you one of those signed book plates from Professor Davis. So I want to thank everyone again for what ended up to be a very successful and wonderful evening. And thank you so much for being with us. And thank you for
Yes,
all
thank
your
you.
work for Florida.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much for streaming in, and thanks for your wonderful questions. I just scanned through them, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to get to the rest of them. They were really good.
Thank you, everyone. And please take care. And we hope to see you again with another Recharge for Reading event. Thanks and good night.